All right, this is part 3 of our series on how to become fluent in Spanish in 2025, and we're going to talk about achieving deep expression in Spanish. If you haven't seen the last 2 videos, go back and watch them, otherwise this video won't make sense. So to recap those 2 videos, we covered how to learn Spanish without being overwhelmed by focusing on the top 1,000 words, and how to break it all down into a step-by-step daily process so that you don't burn out. Now it's time to get all the way to Spanish fluency. You've got a tough task ahead of you in 2025, practicing all of your Spanish to such depth that you can actually say anything you want in Spanish and actually use it to connect more deeply with the people in your life and meet them where they are. So let's imagine that you're mastering the mountain, you're learning all of this stuff step by step, and that's great. But then there's something that often happens when you're trying to chart your own path in Spanish. So you're on the mountain, working on all this grammar stuff, but then you want to talk about a specific topic. But when you look at specific topics you want to talk about, like talking about rabbits or about back pain, it feels like those things are way out here at the edges of the map. So do you have to jump off the mountain, run away from the hard parts of the language, and start working on those instead? But then if you do that, that's typically a dead end. All of these little dots on the map have one thing in common. They're isolated. They're at a really low elevation. So that means that if you start from any of these points, if you then try to go anywhere else on the map, it's going to be an uphill battle. This sometimes leads students who try to follow LearnCraft Spanish to have this kind of false dichotomy. So there's 2 different places you could be, the essentials and your own individual topics, and they're separate from each other. But we're going to break down this false dichotomy based on what we've found works best in coaching. So after you master the hard core stuff on the mountain, when it's time to tailor your learning toward your own personal topics, you're not going to jump straight from the mountain to some fringe case out here. Instead, you're going to chart a course from the mountain toward your own personal learning. You're still going to prioritize what's important, that stuff at the higher elevations, but then it'll be downhill work from there, even into the stuff that you want to talk about that's personal to you. It all leans on that higher leverage stuff. I'm going to cover a 3-step process for making this happen so that you can express anything you want to say in Spanish on any topic. First, I want to tell you about the first time we cracked this problem. So this was a really tough problem we were running into. We've always specialized in getting students to master the top 500 or 1,000 words in Spanish. But then from there, we would often just set students free to figure out how to implement this stuff in their own worlds. And that wasn't always what they wanted. For example, our student Michael loved working with his coach, Carolina, but he was having trouble getting to master certain topics to talk about with his Colombian fiancé. So he was getting to know her family, and he wanted to work really deeply on some more specific topics to be able to bond more deeply with them. And in his case, he was aware he still needed to do 2 things: master some specific stuff to talk with his fiancé's family, but also at the same time, he knew he needed to reinforce some essential grammar. And he was self-aware enough to know that if he moved on from working with us on essential grammar, he might lose his way on the essential core stuff. But he did urgently have to move on to certain topics. So in this case, I actually started working with him one-on-one to help him break through. What we started doing was actually creating combination lessons that involved some of those core top 1,000 essential things he wanted to work on, but incorporating personal topics. I realized while working with him that we could really focus on both at the same time. We could create learning materials for him that focus on the expressive skills he needed in the top 1,000 words, but also incorporate a few new words specific to the topics he wanted to talk about with his in-laws. So for example, he wanted to get more practice with the verb dar and all of its conjugations, especially in the idiom darse cuenta de que. This is one example of something in the top 1,000. He wanted to talk about realizing things in Spanish. He says this all the time in English. He wanted it to be easier to say in Spanish. But he also wanted to combine that with certain things he wanted to talk about with his fiancée. So the coaches and I created a learning package for him that combined a bunch of forms of darse cuenta de que with his own topics that he wanted to practice. He did some drilling with these flashcards and a bunch more. I'm not showing you the more personal things, but these are real examples from his personal set. And after using these flashcards and some other exercises, in his next coaching session, he was able to use this verb and this idiom fluidly because he'd practiced these on his own, step by step. He was also able to use those topics in conversation, and that gave him a big win on this topic and showed him that he could continue to master the essentials and also his own custom topics that he wanted to talk about personally, step by step, without getting lost. So this is how we shattered that false dichotomy between the mountain and the edges of the map. It actually was possible to go even deeper and with more variety at the same time. So now that's the standard way we do custom materials for our coaching students. We combine the personal topics that they feel like talking about with some of the core stuff in the mountain that we know they need more work on. That way, at any time in their learning, they're working on both what's personal and what's essential. To see how this worked out for Michael, you can see his testimonial on our website. Just go to learncraftspanish.com/testimonials and you'll see his face there. But here are a couple of tips for how you can implement this on your own. This is our 3-step process for becoming more expressive on the topics that are important to you. Step 1 is just postponing your own topics. Set your own goals aside and just focus on the mountain. But while focusing on the mountain, try to get as much variety as possible. And I'm talking about infinite variety with these 1,000 words. Infinite variety might sound like you have to practice every single possible phrase in Spanish, but that's not true. If you master the mental models used in the top 1,000 words, the top 100 verbs, all the essential pronouns, there's truly an infinite variety of things you can say just with that, although it's still going to be more or less general. By practicing with variety and depth, you can truly get to the point where you know you can use all those top 1,000 words in any possible combination. Then step 2 is to practice talking about the topic that you want to talk about, but with just the top 1,000 words. So we can get a variety of practice within the top 1,000 words by trying to really stretch them as far as they'll go, even when talking about personal topics. So for example, if you're working with a coach, you've seen this, they're going to force you to talk about the topic that you want to talk about, but using the vocabulary that you have. And even if you're not working with a Spanish coach, you can do this while quizzing with course flashcards and audio quizzes. Here's one way to do this. So just take any given sentence that you're quizzing and slightly modify it to be relevant to the topic you're talking about in Spanish. I chose a random example here. Let's say you're at lesson 150 in the LearnCraft Spanish podcast, and you're practicing the verb sentir. I randomly drew these 2 sentences from our flashcards on sentir. So here are the sentences. You feel like the lady is going to go to the right. Sientes que la dama va a ir hacia la derecha. And how did you feel yesterday? ¿Cómo te sentiste ayer? All right, and let's say the topic that you're thinking of talking about is talking about your pet rabbits with your Argentinian in-laws. How do we modify these sentences to be relevant to the rabbits? So maybe you could say, ¿Sientes que ella va a hacer eso? Or something like that, referring to the rabbit. So you can imagine pointing at the rabbit. Or for the second one, maybe you're pointing at 2 of the rabbits and you say, ¿Cómo se sintieron ayer? Again, you're still using your general vocabulary restricted to the top 1,000 words in Spanish, but you are applying them to personal topics. So in both of these first 2 steps, we're still on the mountain. We're not running out to the edges. We're still reinforcing the top 1,000 words in Spanish. We're just doing it in a way that gives you the path toward what's most meaningful to you. Okay, so that's steps 1 and 2, and that involves just the vocabulary in the top 1,000 words. But then there is starting to learn words that are more specific to you, but without losing sight of what's essential. So for step 3, we're going to start learning a few words specific to you, but just a few at a time, and still leaning on the essentials. To do this, we'll combine those words with the top 1,000 words that you need to work on the most. So here's how we can do this for you, just like we did with Michael King. Let's say that in your case, you want to talk about rabbits with your Argentinian in-laws, but you're specifically having trouble with the hypothetical past tense subjunctive. Here are a couple of sentences that might be useful for you to practice. The rabbits wouldn't do that if they weren't hungry. Los conejos no harían eso si no tuvieran hambre. Or maybe talking about your in-laws' family. If my niece weren't hungry, she wouldn't be asking for dessert. Si mi sobrina no tuviera hambre, no estaría pidiendo postre. So once again, we've added a couple of words in that are relevant to what you want to do, but primarily what we're practicing is this core expression. Core expression in the top 1,000 words is still what's essential to saying what you personally want to say in Spanish. You're just using it to talk about more specific topics while reinforcing that. Here's what kind of difference this approach made for Christine, who's another one of our 12-month students that's finishing up right now. Christine's grandparents spoke Spanish, but her parents didn't. And Christine has always wanted to speak the language of her ancestors and better communicate with the Spanish speakers around her. Christine has been working on Spanish for varying degrees for decades, ever since high school, so she's had lots of different experiences doing it with mixed results. But after 10 months in our cohort program, here's where she is now. She says, "I'm still far from perfect, but I can say what I want to say." I'm not even sure how to quantify this because I went from basically noun knowledge to having complete conversations in Spanish about in-depth topics. As I write this, I'm sitting at the kitchen table of a Mexican family that lives in a small town in QR outside of the tourist zone of Mexico. I've been here 2.5 weeks. Nobody speaks English in this house. A few people in town know a few English words. I've not only been able to get along here, but I've made relationships and lifelong friendships. There's absolutely no way I would have thrived here without LearnCraft Spanish. I would have suffered and struggled and probably hated my time here. Instead, it has been enriching and really quite magical. I can even make jokes and understand jokes. A few days ago, I was at dinner with my host family in Mexico. The dad asked me a question and I answered it seamlessly. I stopped for a minute because I was thinking, did he just talk to me in English? What's happening? He doesn't speak English. How did I understand that? What? So put yourself in Christine's shoes. She's speaking Spanish without realizing she's speaking Spanish. And that's because of leaning on the essentials and working into the personal stuff from there systematically, not jumping out to the edges. Can you see how big of a difference this will make if you go deep by mastering the core of the language? And here's what Alicia had to say about grammar. So it's interesting, Alicia came in with the mindset of wanting to be funny in Spanish. But she realized pretty quickly that to be funny in Spanish, she just needed to be funny and to know how to communicate and express those funny thoughts with another language. She says, by learning the grammar, I'm not only able to effectively communicate my humor, but create additional laughs by playing with the language. Word puns, wordplay, playing with sounds and rhyming, quick use of synonyms, adjectives, adverbs, making fun of myself for all of those efforts. I wouldn't be able to do this with vocabulary alone. This part of comedy comes from knowing how and why you would or wouldn't say certain things. Until LearnCraft Spanish, until understanding the grammar, I wasn't able to do this. Now I can make native Spanish strangers laugh within seconds, and I'm working on incorporating Spanish into my stand-up comedy routines. So imagine being able to be your truest self, but in your second language. There's truly nothing like it. Imagine mastering core grammar so well that you can be completely confident that no matter what topic you want to learn next, no matter what direction you want to go in Spanish, you are going to be able to express yourself deeply and personally on that topic. And it'll completely change your life. All right, speaking of changing your life, it's the moment of truth. How did I do? Are you convinced that you can become fluent in Spanish in 2025? Based on the first video, do you think that if you focus on the 1,000-word mountain, you'll be able to master core fluency in Spanish? Based on the second video, do you think you can take the excitement of your ultimate fluency goal and channel that into the step-by-step daily work using a plan for all of 2025 to keep that motivation going all year long until you're fluent? And also, based on today's video, are you convinced that beyond just the mountain, you're going to be able to start expanding your core fluency into topics that are important to you by working on expressing yourself in more and more personal ways? So once again, picture that vision of mastering core expressive Spanish by the end of 2025. Do you think that with this 12-month plan, you'll be able to achieve that vision? Please comment on this video and tell me if you're convinced. And then tomorrow, watch for a very short bonus video where we have an exciting announcement. As you can probably tell, we're really excited about 2025, and our goal is to help more people become truly fluent in Spanish than ever. We want to fill the world with more success stories like what you've heard from Alicia, Christine, Lisa, Jonathan, and Ryan. And you could be the next success story if you watch your email and this channel tomorrow. Here's to being fluent in Spanish in 2025.